All right, here we go. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan Rohrer, and I am in San Francisco. I'm the pastor of Grace Lutheran, and we're at www.gracesf.com. And Dan's on a slightly different arrangement today because Dan's in a new location. Dan's voice is coming from a telephone, and Dan's face is coming from a live streamed video. So if they don't sync up all of the time, that's why. But we're just grateful that Dan gets to join us. Dan, where are you at today?
I am so, when they say something is like make a relationship Facebook official, I'm going to make something Bible Study That Doesn't Suck official right now. I am the new pastor at St. Mark's Lutheran Church of Roswell, New Mexico.
Yay!
And I am I just had my first led worship for the first time this past Sunday here. And I'm really excited to be here. Worship is at 10:15. It's great. I can sleep in on Sunday, which is really kind of rare. 10:15 a.m. on Sunday morning. And we do not have a web page yet, but we have a Facebook page. And the Facebook page is, I think, St. Mark's Lutheran. They're I don't know if I told you this, Megan, they're live streaming my sermons every week. So you get to see me and hear me on the Facebook page. So
check it out, everybody.
Yeah. So exciting times, and there's lots going on here, but I'm still figuring out what all is going on here. So I'm still learning my way and moving in.
Well,
but I'm excited to be here. I miss a month of Bible Study That Doesn't Suck, so I'm excited to be back.
Glad to have you back, and glad you're in your new digs, and glad we didn't accidentally ruin the surprise by talking about it too early in our previous Bible. Yeah. This Sunday, if you are in the Bay Area, is Pride, and that's in honor of the Stonewall riots that happened in New York in the 60s. And so there'll be a lot of unique kinds of worship services at churches across the country, and a lot more rainbow colors at churches across the country, which is a wonderful thing. And if you make it to a congregation that's using the lectionary, which is a 3-year cycle of biblical readings that most mainline Protestant congregations use, you'll be hearing the texts that we're talking about today in Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. The first one comes from the book of Job. It's spelt like Job, but pronounced Job. And Job is a story about a time God was unjust. But you're not allowed to say that God's unjust, because this Bible verse that we're reading today will tell you why. So Satan made a bet with God, saying that Job was only faithful because Job had good things in life. And Satan at the time was not the red-horned evildoer that you imagine in your head, but Satan was a person who actually worked for God. Satan's job was to go back and forth like a messenger, and would go to God and say, if people were faithful when God wasn't looking, are you a good Christian when God's back is turned, is kind of the equivalent of what Satan's job was. So Satan goes to God and says, Job is faithful, but it's only because Job has good things. And if you take away everything that Job has, Job's totally going to not really be faithful to you. And God was like, okay, let's see if that's true. And takes away everything that Job has. Slaughters all of Job's family, slaughters all of Job's children, destroys all of the livestock, takes away all of Job's wealth. It gets so bad that there's a point where Job is sitting in a pit naked, has no clothes, has nothing. Job's friends are doubting Job and saying, well, if God took all this stuff away, it must mean that Job is terrible, and Job must have deserved it, because God wouldn't just take things away from someone who didn't deserve it. And so finally, after a super long story, after 37 chapters of terrible things happening to Job, finally speaks out and tells God that what's happening isn't fair. And Job is right. But here's why Job is wrong. By karma standards, Job did not get what Job deserved. But this God of the Hebrew Bible does not work on karma. This is a God who is able to come back and remind Job, I am God and you are not. And this is kind of the put Job in Job's place section of God's reply to Job, saying, did you create the world? How do you know how the world's supposed to work? Were you there when I made everything put together or put the cornerstone of the world together? Were you there when the stars could sing and shout for joy? Were you there when the sea came out of a womb? Right? And so the whole idea is that God's justice is not necessarily discernible by human beings. It doesn't make sense. It exists in a different type of time, meaning that God's justice could come at this end time, a teleos, at the end of the world, or the great judgment. That's not in this part of the book of Job, but it's saying, you don't know what's up. You're a human. I'm God and you're not. And basically Job's response is, you're right. God, at the end of this story, gives back all of the things that Job lost. So God gives Job a new wife. God gives Job some new kids. God gives Job a new farm. Job gets everything back. But if you've ever had kids die or a wife die, you know that they can't be replaced. It doesn't make up for the fact that you were murdered to have God give you a bunch of in the same way that Dan's video might not make sense to you either. That's all right. Dan charged headphones for a telephone and is working on getting things reassembled. That's what's happening.
I am.
Pastor Dan right now.
I am.
So Job is a very, very long book. It's beautifully written. It's great poetry, but it is about God being God and you're not God. And so if you think you've got everything figured out, if you think you're the mastermind of the world, if you think you understand all of the Bible, Job is a book of the Bible that is always there to remind us that the more we think we have it figured out, the more we need to be reminded that God is in charge and we are not God. And so this is a text that pastors read to remember that they don't have the whole world figured out. This is a text that members of congregations can read to remember they don't have the whole world figured out. It's a kind of text that can comfort people when they've lost everything, to say that God is in charge, that there's a bigger plan even if we don't understand it. Hopefully we don't say that in abusive ways that are mean to people who have just lost very important people in their lives. But it's a part of the ongoing conversation. And if you have ever wondered how God could be good and allow things like the Holocaust to happen, know that this is an ancient wondering. It's an ancient story. And it's an ancient conversation that people have been wrestling with. We don't have the right answer because God is God and we are not. But we as faithful people have tried to sort it out for a really long time. Pastor Dan.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. When I read this, Job is a really interesting story, actually. There's a lot of interesting sort of ways to think about God and think about theology. And I will often on Bible study that doesn't sort of either praise or complain about the way that the lectionary is put together. But this is probably one of the better ones. When I saw this, I was reminded of Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 55. My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. And I think sometimes we let our brains take over for our hearts, and I think there has to be a balance. But sometimes it's hard to accept that God has a way of doing things that sometimes doesn't seem logical. And I think it fits a little bit with the gospel we were talking about later too. That Jesus is almost like annoyed later on. He's like, "Ugh, you guys, I have my own way of doing these things, and you clearly aren't understanding the way,
You
So,
can talk about
so
Mark.
I think it's difficult for us, as especially in our culture today, to that whole thing, let go and let God. It's a nice thing to say, but sometimes it's really hard to do. Sometimes it's really hard just to say, okay, I don't know, I don't understand what's going on. I think God has a plan here, and I don't know if I understand it, but I'm just going to let go and let whatever happens happen. It's hard for us not to want to control things. We want to control every aspect of everything that happens, and I think if we do that, we let ourselves down a lot of the time. The more we try to force things to happen a certain way, the more we end up being, unhappy.
Yeah.
If we, I trust me, through the whole process of ending up in this call in Roswell, there were times that, and I'm not, even if someone from Roswell watches this, they know there are times that I wasn't super excited about coming here, but now I'm super happy about that I'm here. I love the people here. I love this call. But there were times in the process that I sort of questioned it, and there were other places that I was looking at that I really had to let go a couple points, and I said, okay, I don't know where I'm headed or why I'm headed wherever I end up, but I need to just let go, and that's hard to do, because especially in my previous call, it ended in a positive way, but it didn't. But part of the way that ended was difficult because they wanted to keep me, and I kind of wanted to stay. So when you're leaving a place where you've grown into, and you move not only to another church but another state, you're sort of forced to let go, and you're sort of forced to say, okay, well, what's happening next? And so I think sometimes a passage like this, the in Job and also the one in Isaiah, you can read them two different ways. You can read them as, you can get frustrated at it.
Yep.
You can say, oh, well, great. I want to know what's going on, and you're just telling me just tough, deal with it. But I think the flip side is you can also find comfort in that, saying, if you're willing to let go, God will put you in the right place. That in the long run you can find comfort in that, if you're willing to find comfort in it, I guess is what I'm saying. So it can go both directions with how you read that.
It's a helpful message, I think, for people who have been in power in congregations beyond term limits, or who their families have been in power for a really long time, and they get really nervous when there's new leadership, that everything's going to fall apart, that everyone's going to do everything wrong. And the reading from Mark is really interesting. Like, previously when I've read this text, I've thought about how often people will, I thought about how annoying it was that Jesus wasn't afraid of all of the same things that the disciples were afraid of. And I've also in the past really focused on this text about how God is in charge of all of the world, and we need to calm and relax. But this year, as I'm reading this text, I'm thinking about how our sense of what is an emergency might not match somebody else's sense of what is an emergency. So if one person thinks it's an emergency to make sure everyone's sorting the trash properly, that might not be an emergency to anyone else in the building. Other people might think that an emergency is a letter from the IRS. That might not be someone else's sense of what an emergency is. And still other people might think that an emergency is when there's a fire or when someone has died, right? Like a first responder sense of what an emergency is. And so for Jesus in this instance, he is not nervous of boats and storms. It's weird because the people who spent their life on boats in storms are nervous, and they would have known when things were going a bit topsy-turvy and haywire. And it's interesting to me that of all of the things that you can be afraid of in the natural world, it's really a fight with church leaders that is what gets Jesus killed, right? It's inter-religious fighting that causes the death of Jesus. It's not fighting with a hurricane or fighting with a windstorm. So that, I just thought that was kind of an interesting way to reread this text. I'm going to add some power to my computer. Hold on. Go ahead and talk.
Well, yeah. I find it actually a really interesting passage. I always think of this as a reminder for us to have, especially pastors, but also other people, to take our Sabbath, to be really intentional about finding time to rest. There are times that Jesus can get away. I remember the passage about when he's visiting with Mary and Martha, and the disciples aren't with him. So there are times that he sort of takes a break here and there. But this one, depending on which, I'd have to go back and look. I'm not entirely sure. So I have been wrong occasionally when I said this sort of thing on Bible study that doesn't suck. But I think in Matthew and Luke, this happens in a different order, in a different sort of place. But here he's just gone from doing a lot of teaching of parables to a lot of people, to and some healing, to he needs some rest. He's tired, and the next couple chapters he's going to be very, very busy too. So he's just, I don't think we give Jesus enough time to rest. I think the times that in the Bible he's taking a little break or he's getting a nap are just as important as when he's teaching us something. And you almost want to blame Jesus. Like, didn't you see that they're drowning? It actually says the boat was being swamped. And Jesus says, you almost want to be on the side of the disciples for a minute. You're like, well, they're being practical. They don't want to die. It has nothing to do with faith. There are practical parts of it. But at the same time, regardless of what's happening, it is about faith, but it's also about giving Jesus some space. And I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier about, God's ways are not your ways. Is Jesus saying, I was going to take care of it? I know what I'm going to do. Or the storm is going to end and you're all going to be fine. Like, God's ways are not your ways. I know what's going on. Just give me a moment to take a nap. It's actually a really interesting passage, I think, because his response is a little, I don't know, peculiar. He says, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? Well, it's pretty obvious why they were afraid. There was a big storm. It says a huge storm, a great windstorm, and the waves beat the boat. The boat was already being swamped. And like you said, these were about half of the disciples were either fishermen by trade or had some connection with fishing. So they knew if they were afraid, they had reason to be afraid. So I think there's more to it than just, you little faith. I think Jesus is saying something a little bit deeper about let God be God and let God take a nap. So
I don't know. I think God should
maybe.
Absolutely. The Corinthians reading is written at a time where they thought Jesus was going to come back like tomorrow, or maybe a little later, but they're writing as if they thought Jesus was going to come back tomorrow. And so the argument here is, if you know that Jesus is coming tomorrow, don't do anything dumb to screw it up, right? Don't do anything that's going to get you in trouble. Don't do anything complicated. Don't do anything ethically risky. Jesus is coming tomorrow. All you have to do is make it through the end of the week. And the idea is about not putting stumbling blocks in front of other people, not avoiding yucky things, right? So through great endurance in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, and genuine love, truthful speech, and power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute, in good repute. We are treated as impostors, as yet are true, as unknown, and yet well unknown, as dying, and see we are alive, as punished, and yet not killed, as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, and yet possessing everything. And this idea is to open your heart, and instead of thinking of your heart as having restrictions and afflictions, but to try to open yourself wide to care for each other and for other children of God. So don't do things that are going to hamper that, even in the midst of other people being really jerky to you. It's a hard, impossible way to live. But remember, that was a way that they could only live for a short period of time. And so maybe the hardest thing that we have to do as contemporary Christians is to figure out how to live knowing that it might be a while before Jesus comes back. I mean, if Jesus comes back tomorrow, thank God, because I'll have less work to do. But if Jesus doesn't come back tomorrow and we all have to figure out how to live together over the long run, that's way harder. It's way harder to figure out how to live in harmony and in peace and to avoid conflict. So it's an interesting text.
I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating that I think we have to be really careful how people of faith and pastors read Paul, because when Paul first wrote his first book that he wrote, he was a recent convert, right? Mm-hmm. He was, he probably wrote within a handful of years after being converted and being baptized, and so his theology changes a lot in the roughly 10 years that he writes. And so, kind of like you alluded to, his early writings, I had a seminary professor that referred to, you have to know that these writings have to do with, he thought the second coming was coming next Tuesday. They always said next Tuesday. Next Tuesday is the second coming. So if you're writing thinking that next Tuesday is the second coming, that's different from when the end of his writing was, probably Romans was probably one, if not the last book that he wrote. The theology is very different then. It says, by all means get married, by all means do these things. And so it sounds like Paul is contradicting himself, but really it's over 10 years he has rethought things, and by the time he writes Romans, Jesus is not coming next Tuesday. We have to be patient and wait for Jesus to come. So Paul is problematic. You really have to be careful how you use Paul, I think, because you can pit Paul against Paul sometimes. I'm not saying that's totally contradictory, but some things that Paul says really change. And so I think there's a trend in churches today that they focus a lot of their teaching on Paul, especially what I would say the more problematic areas of Paul. Well, we're Christians, so here we're quoting Paul. And usually it's parts of Paul that I kind of go, you have to understand the context of why he said what he said and where he was in his own past when you say that. It's not that Paul isn't, some of the most beautiful things written in the whole Bible were written by Paul. But some of the most hateful things written in the whole Bible were written by Paul.
Right.
So you have to take that into the context of where he was in his own spiritual journey.
Yeah.
So that's why sometimes I often preach from sort of what we call a historical critical position, and that is you have to understand what was the position of, what was the writer about, what was going on in the writer's life, in the writer's culture, and the circumstances around what Paul was writing and how he was writing and his life was about changed really dramatically from his first writing to his last writing.
Yeah.
That affects how we read it. So, like you said, this is one of his earlier writings. So the whole theology is you just have to take that into account when you're talking about it.
Yeah.
And if you don't read it with that lens, if you're reading it just on the outside, like Paul said this, so we need to follow this, you're missing part of the point. I'm saying this in a general way, not just about this passage, but Paul, I'm really weary of people who, when they quote the Bible, they only quote Paul.
Yeah.
Because I almost feel like every time, even when I quote Paul, I'll say, every time you quote Paul, you should quote it with like a subtext. I love this passage of Paul in Romans, and here's where Paul was at that point. I know no one's going to do that, but you have to understand that Paul is not equal to Paul, right? That Paul's situation changes so much that you really have when you quote Paul, you have to quote from the context.
Yeah, and Paul begins with a job which is genocide of Christians to being someone who is a Christian and who is interested in what Christians are into. And so it would be the equivalent of having Adolf Hitler write Jewish poetry after the Holocaust to be listening to what Paul is up to, right? Paul's actively killing Christians. Now he's not actively killing Christians, but he's writing advice to them. Like, most places would be like, we're going to take a pause before we take all your advice. It's endured the test of time because some of the writing comes from a really deep natural place, like this idea that he wrestled really with some of the deepest ethical questions that one could wrestle with. But you can't forget that dude used to commit genocide. So.
Right. Thank you. I lost my audio for a second, but I can hear you again.
Hooray! Good. Your sound's back up again too, so that's good stuff. I don't know. I don't have more thoughts about these readings. Do you have more thoughts about these readings, Dan? The Psalm's really pretty. If you haven't read Psalm 107 before, it's put in here because it shows you where the story about Jesus originated. This story of Jesus calming the sea. It's hard to tell if it was a thing that 100% happened, or if it's written based off of Psalm 107 to make sure that you know that Jesus is the Messiah. I kind of like the original story better in Psalm 107 about God whispering. So yeah.
I feel like one of the themes that goes throughout these texts is don't worry, God will take care of you. God will take care of you. Let God take care of you the way that God's going to take care of you. Because that's sort of in Job, it's sort of in the Psalms, and it's sort of in the Gospel that I actually posted. You know me, I can ramble, but I promise this will be my last little comment. I was asked to write an article for the church newsletter for the first time here, and one of my favorite passages is about from Matthew 6. Don't worry. Consider the lilies of the field, the birds of the air. God takes care of them. How many of you, by worrying, have added a single hour to your life? I think that's sort of reflected here too. That we have a lot of stuff that we could worry about. A lot of like you said earlier about what constitutes an emergency to one person might be totally different to another person.
Yeah.
And I needed to remind myself a lot that I need to just step back and not worry, because it doesn't help me, and all it does is cause me more stress. So if I step back and say, okay, this will work itself out. God will find a way through this. I think that's part of this. Like, it's all about God. God will be with us and will help us and will save us if we need saving, and we just need to trust.
Yeah.
Right. That's sort of a common theme here, and I while my head doesn't always agree with that, I think it helps my heart to think that way. It helps my faith life to say, okay, God got this.
Yeah.
And when I've been able to let go, I've found that it's true that things work out.
Yeah.
They just do.
Yeah. And if you haven't had that moment yet, if you notice more darkness than light in the world, then I want to remind you that God loves you and names you and claims you, thinks of you more times than there are grain of sand on the earth, and won't let you go regardless of any way that anyone ever lies to you about that. So know that you are loved and that can't be taken away. Take care.
Amen.
Hold on.
Great